The death of China's first emperor in 210 BC shattered the known world. Qin Shi Huang, the iron-fisted ruler who had unified China through brutal efficiency and unprecedented administrative control, died far from home during an inspection tour of his eastern provinces. His body was secretly transported back to the capital in a covered wagon, surrounded by cartloads of rotting fish to disguise the smell of decomposition. Within just 3 years of his passing, the mighty Qin Empire, built on terror, standardization, and absolute control, would collapse into chaos and civil war. The second emperor, Qin Shi, proved utterly incapable of maintaining his father's iron grip on the vast empire stretching from the northern steppes to the southern seas. Court intrigues flourished in the power vacuum, particularly those orchestrated by the cunning eunuch Zhao Gao, who manipulated the young emperor like a puppet on strings. The harsh legalist policies that had sustained Qin rule through fear and collective punishment began generating widespread resentment among populations who had never known such systematic oppression. The Qin administrative system, built on severe punishments and collective responsibility, where entire families could be executed for one member's crime, had functioned effectively only under the first emperor's personal oversight and commanding presence. Without him watching from above, the mechanisms of control began to malfunction catastrophically. Local officials, terrified of punishment for any perceived failure, resorted to increasingly desperate and cruel measures to meet impossible quotas. The empire was a pressure cooker about to explode, and everyone could feel it coming. The massive construction projects that had defined the Qin era continued even after the emperor's death, draining the treasury and exhausting the population. The Great Wall stretched across northern horizons, built with the bones of hundreds of thousands of conscripted laborers. The Imperial Mausoleum, with its legendary terracotta army, consumed resources on an unimaginable scale. Extensive road networks crisscrossed the empire, all built through forced labor and human suffering. Peasants across China faced crushing tax burdens, sometimes up to 2/3 of their harvest went to the state. Corvée labor obligations meant abandoning fields during critical agricultural seasons to work on government projects. Men were dragged from their homes for months or years, leaving families to starve. The standardization policies that had initially brought order to diverse regions now felt oppressive. Local populations were forced to abandon traditional customs, ancient writing systems, familiar weights and measures, everything that defined their identity. The book-burning campaigns and execution of scholars had eliminated many educated administrators who might have provided effective governance. The bureaucracy increasingly depended on military officers and harsh disciplinarians who understood only force, lacking any nuance required for civil administration. By 209 BC, natural disasters combined with administrative breakdown and popular discontent created perfect conditions for rebellion. The spark came from the most unexpected source imaginable: a group of peasant conscripts delayed by rain, facing death for tardiness, who decided they had absolutely nothing left to lose. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, leaders of these delayed conscripts, raised the banner of revolt in Zhejiang rather than face certain execution under Qin law. Their cry echoed across China. "Kings and nobles, are they born different from us?" This revolutionary sentiment spread like wildfire through a population that had endured decades of oppression. Within weeks, rebellions erupted across the empire like pustules on diseased skin. Among the countless individuals swept up in this chaos was Liu Bang, a man whose humble origins made him perhaps the most unlikely candidate for imperial power in Chinese history. Born in Pei County in the old kingdom of Chu, Liu Bang came from a peasant family with no distinctions, no connections to aristocratic networks that typically produced political leaders. His father was a simple farmer who worked the land with his own hands. Liu Bang himself showed zero interest in scholarly pursuits or military training during his youth. Instead, he developed a reputation as something of a ne'er-do-well. spending his time drinking with friends in local taverns, gambling, avoiding serious responsibilities, charming women, and generally behaving like someone destined for nothing more than mediocrity. His family despaired of him. Village elders shook their heads. Everyone assumed Liu Bang would amount to nothing, dying as obscurely as he'd been born. They could not have been more spectacularly wrong about what destiny had in store. Yet despite his unpromising beginnings, Liu Bang possessed certain qualities that would prove absolutely crucial in the turbulent years ahead. He had an intuitive, almost supernatural understanding of human nature, an ability to read people's hearts and motivations that went far beyond normal perception. He could inspire fierce loyalty among diverse groups of people who had nothing in common except their devotion to him. His informal manner and willingness to treat subordinates as equals rather than maintaining rigid hierarchical distinctions attracted followers who might have been repelled by more conventional authority figures. This egalitarian approach was particularly effective among the displaced peasants, bandits, and minor officials who formed the core of many rebel groups during the anti-Qin uprising. Liu Bang didn't demand respect because of his birth or position. He earned it through his character and his genuine care for those who served him. He would sit and drink with common soldiers, listening to their complaints, sharing their hardships. This was revolutionary in ancient China's rigidly stratified society. By his 30s, Liu Bang had managed to secure a minor position as a pavilion chief in his home county, a low-level administrative post, responsible for maintaining order in a small district and escorting convicts to labor projects. This position, while hardly prestigious by any measure, gave him invaluable experience in dealing with both common people and government officials. These skills of mediation, negotiation, and understanding different perspectives would serve him extraordinarily well in the years to come when he needed to manage coalitions of diverse interests and competing egos. It was while serving as pavilion chief that Liu Bang encountered the event that would utterly transform his life and alter the course of Chinese history. He was assigned to escort a group of convicts to work on the first emperor's massive mausoleum project, but several prisoners escaped during the journey. Knowing that the penalty for losing prisoners was severe, likely execution, and recognizing that more convicts would probably escape before they reached their destination, Liu Bang made a decision that reflected both pragmatism and a certain reckless courage that would characterize his entire career. Rather than continue the journey and face inevitable punishment, he simply released all the remaining prisoners and told them to flee for their lives. Some of these men, deeply impressed by his unexpected mercy and perhaps recognizing that he had sacrificed his own safety for theirs, chose to remain with him voluntarily. This small group of grateful ex-convicts formed the nucleus of what would eventually become a formidable military and political force that would conquer all of China. Liu Bang's entry into active rebellion came in 209 BC, shortly after news of Chen Sheng's uprising reached his region and spread like wildfire through the countryside. Unlike many rebel leaders who proclaimed grand ideological goals or claimed ancient noble lineages to justify their actions, Liu Bang's initial motivations were largely practical and survival-oriented. He had already made himself an outlaw by releasing the convicts. The spreading rebellion offered both an opportunity for advancement and a means of survival in an increasingly chaotic world where the old rules no longer applied and new possibilities emerged daily. His first military actions were small-scale affairs, attacking local Qin officials who had become symbols of oppression, seizing control of his home county with help from local magistrates who had decided to join the rebellion rather than go down with the sinking Qin ship. The early phase of Liu Bang's rebellion revealed both his strengths and his limitations as a military leader. He was not a brilliant tactician in the conventional sense, lacking the formal military education that characterized many of his rivals who had studied ancient texts and classical strategies. However, he demonstrated an exceptional, almost preternatural ability to recruit capable subordinates and delegate authority effectively. Unlike leaders who needed to control everything personally, Liu Bang recognized his own limitations and empowered talented individuals to exercise their skills. His willingness to listen to advice from others, combined with his skill at maintaining unity among diverse groups of followers with competing interests, allowed him to build a more stable and effective organization than many rebel leaders who relied primarily on personal charisma or military prowess alone. Among the key figures who joined Liu Bang during this crucial early period was Xiao He, a former county official who became his chief administrator and would later serve as chancellor of the Han Dynasty. Xiao He's bureaucratic expertise and organizational genius complemented Liu Bang's leadership skills perfectly, providing the administrative foundation necessary for governing conquered territories effectively. Another crucial early ally was Cao Can, a former prison official who proved to be an effective and ruthless military commander. Fan Kuai, a former butcher with no formal training whatsoever, became one of Liu Bang's most trusted and effective generals through sheer courage and loyalty. As the anti-Qin rebellion spread across China like flames across dry grassland, numerous regional leaders emerged from the chaos, each controlling different territories and pursuing their own agendas, their own visions for China's future. The most formidable of these was Xiang Yu, a member of the Chu aristocracy whose family had served as generals for the old Chu kingdom before its conquest by Qin. Xiang Yu's grandfather, Xiang Yan, had been a famous general who died fighting Qin armies, making young Xiang Yu the heir to a military legacy that shaped his entire worldview. Xiang Yu possessed many qualities that Liu Bang utterly lacked. He was physically imposing, standing over 6 feet tall with a commanding presence that inspired both fear and admiration among his followers. Ancient texts describe him as having the strength of 10 men, capable of lifting heavy bronze tripods that normal men couldn't budge. His military skills were legendary even in his early 20s, and he had received the classical education appropriate to his aristocratic background, studying ancient texts and military treatises. The contrast between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu extended far beyond their personal characteristics to their fundamental approaches to leadership and warfare. Xiang Yu embodied the traditional warrior aristocrat, leading from the front in battle with his distinctive halberd, expecting personal loyalty based on his noble birth and martial prowess, viewing warfare as an extension of personal honor and aristocratic virtue. His tactical brilliance was undeniable. He won virtually every battle he fought during the rebellion period through a combination of personal courage, tactical innovation, and sheer martial skill. But his strategic thinking was often limited by his aristocratic worldview and his preference for dramatic gestures over careful planning. The first major confrontation between the various rebel forces and the remaining Qin military came when a large imperial army was dispatched to suppress the rebellion and restore order through the traditional method of overwhelming force. Rather than face this threat individually and be destroyed piecemeal, the rebel leaders agreed to coordinate their efforts under the nominal leadership of King Huai of Chu, a descendant of the old Chu royal house who had been installed as a figurehead ruler to provide legitimacy to the rebellion. This coalition arrangement established the framework for what would become known as the Chu-Han contention, though at this stage, Liu Bang and Xiang Yu were still ostensibly allies working toward the common goal of overthrowing the hated Qin dynasty. The campaign against the remaining Qin forces revealed the different strengths and approaches of the two future rivals in ways that foreshadowed their eventual confrontation. Xiang Yu's forces achieved the most spectacular victories, including the decisive Battle of Julu in 207 BC, where his army defeated a much larger Qin force through a combination of tactical brilliance and desperate courage that became legendary. According to historical accounts that may be somewhat embellished but capture the essential truth, Xiang Yu ordered his men to destroy their cooking pots and sink their boats after crossing a river to engage the enemy, leaving them literally no option but victory or death. This battle established Xiang Yu as the preeminent military leader of the anti-Qin coalition and earned him the prestigious title of Hegemon King of Western Chu. While Xiang Yu was winning dramatic victories against Qin armies in pitched battles that would be celebrated in songs and stories, Liu Bang was pursuing a fundamentally different strategy that would ultimately prove far more effective for achieving lasting control. Rather than seeking decisive battles for glory and reputation, he focused on systematically capturing territory and establishing administrative control over conquered regions, building infrastructure of governance rather than monuments to military genius. His forces moved westward along a southern route, deliberately avoiding major Qin strongholds where they might face catastrophic defeat, while systematically occupying smaller cities and towns with minimal resistance. This approach allowed him to build up his resource base and recruit additional troops from liberated populations while avoiding the heavy casualties that characterized Xiang Yu's glorious but costly campaigns. Liu Bang was playing the long game while Xiang Yu sought immediate triumph. Liu Bang's strategic patience and unglamorous approach were rewarded when he became the first rebel leader to reach the Qin capital region. While Xiang Yu was still engaged in major battles elsewhere, consolidating his reputation as the greatest warrior of the age, Liu Bang's forces approached Xianyang, the Qin capital, in late 207 BC. The Qin court, already weakened by internal power struggles following the death of the second emperor and the loss of most of their military forces in unsuccessful campaigns against the rebels, was unable to mount any effective resistance against even Liu Bang's relatively modest forces. The third emperor of Qin, who had succeeded Qin Ershi after a palace coup orchestrated by the surviving court factions, surrendered to Liu Bang's forces without a fight, recognizing the futility of resistance. Liu Bang's occupation of the Qin capital demonstrated his remarkable political acumen and his deep understanding of the broader implications of the rebellion beyond mere military conquest. Rather than allowing his troops to sack the city as was customary and expected after capturing an enemy capital, his soldiers were anticipating rich rewards for their service. He maintained strict discipline and protected the population from abuse. He also made a deliberate point of treating the surrendered Qin officials with respect and dignity, incorporating those who were willing to serve into his administration rather than executing them as enemies or collaborators with the hated regime. These actions helped establish his reputation as a legitimate ruler rather than merely a successful bandit leader, demonstrating that he understood governance required more than military victory. It required winning hearts and minds. The fall of the Qin capital did not immediately end the dynasty as Qin forces continued to resist in some outlying regions, but it marked the effective collapse of centralized imperial authority and the end of the system that had unified China just decades earlier. More importantly, for the future course of Chinese history, it set the stage for the confrontation between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu that would determine who would inherit the Qin Empire and shape China's destiny for centuries. According to prior agreements among the rebel leaders made when the coalition was formed, whoever first entered the capital region would be granted rule over the strategic Guangzhong area, which included the former Qin heartland with its rich agricultural resources and strategic defensive position. Liu Bang's success in reaching this goal first, through his unglamorous but effective strategy, gave him a significant political advantage and a strong territorial base. But it also made him a target for Xiang Yu's ambitions and resentment. When Xiang Yu arrived at the capital region with his much larger and more battle-hardened army shortly after Liu Bang's occupation, the stage was set for the first direct confrontation between the two leaders. Xiang Yu's forces vastly outnumbered Liu Bang's troops. Estimates suggest a ratio of perhaps 4 or 5 to 1, and many observers expected the aristocratic general to simply eliminate his rival and claim undisputed leadership of the anti-Qin coalition through superior force. However, the famous meeting between the two leaders at Hongmen revealed the complex political calculations and personal dynamics that would characterize their future relationship throughout the coming conflict. The Hongmen Banquet, as this meeting came to be known in Chinese history and literature, demonstrated both Liu Bang's extraordinary political skills and the personal dynamics that would shape the coming conflict between ambition and honor, pragmatism and principle. Xiang Yu, despite his overwhelming military superiority and the urgings of some advisors to eliminate his rival immediately while he had the chance, was influenced by other counselors who argued against attacking Liu Bang precipitously. Some argued that eliminating a fellow rebel leader who had just helped overthrow the Qin might damage Xiang Yu's reputation for honor and make other coalition members question their own safety if they cooperated with him. Others suggested that Liu Bang could be more useful as a subordinate ally than as a dead enemy, martyred and potentially inspiring resistance. Liu Bang's behavior during this absolutely crucial meeting, where his life hung by a thread, showed his remarkable ability to navigate dangerous political situations through a combination of apparent humility and careful calculation beneath the surface. He acknowledged Xiang Yu's superior status with all appropriate ceremony, agreed to withdraw from the capital region without resistance, but he also managed to secure recognition of his claim to rule the remote region of Hanzhong in the far west, a territory that seemed like exile but would prove to be his salvation. This territory of Hanzhong, while far less prestigious and wealthy than the central plains that Xiang Yu would control, was strategically defensible due to its mountain barriers and provided a secure base from which Liu Bang could rebuild his strength away from Xiang Yu's immediate oversight. The division of the former Qin Empire among the various rebel leaders created a complex patchwork of kingdoms and territories that reflected both the coalition's diversity and the fundamental contradictions in their alliance that made future conflict inevitable. Xiang Yu, as the dominant military leader with the largest army and greatest reputation, claimed the title of Hegemon King of Western Chu and established his capital at Pengcheng in the east, positioning himself as the supreme authority over all other kings. He distributed other territories among his allies and subordinates in a grand ceremony, creating a feudal system that resembled the pre-Qin period more than the centralized empire that had just fallen, essentially turning back the clock on unification. Liu Bang's acceptance of rule over Hanzhong appeared to represent a significant defeat and reduction in his status, as this region was isolated from the main centers of Chinese civilization by difficult mountain terrain that made communication and trade challenging. However, this apparent setback actually provided him with several crucial advantages that would become apparent in the coming years and ultimately prove decisive in the struggle for supremacy. The isolation that made Hanzhong seem like an exile also made it highly defensible. The mountain passes could be held by relatively small forces against much larger armies, preventing Xiang Yu from easily attacking him. The region's position at the western edge of Chinese civilization also meant that it had been less thoroughly integrated into the Qin administrative system, making it easier for Liu Bang to establish his own governmental structures and experiment with new policies without interference from entrenched bureaucratic interests or traditional power structures. More importantly, for the long term, Liu Bang's time in Hanzhong allowed him to demonstrate his administrative abilities and his vision for what post-Qin China could become if governed wisely rather than harshly. Rather than simply maintaining military control over his territory through force and fear, he began implementing policies that would later characterize Han rule throughout China and establish the principles of his dynasty. He dramatically reduced the harsh punishments that had defined Qin law, replacing them with more moderate penalties that still maintained order but did not terrorize the population into submission. He eliminated many of the collective responsibility provisions that had made entire families and communities live in fear of punishment for any member's transgression. He also began actively recruiting scholars and administrators who had survived the Qin persecution of intellectuals, recognizing that effective governance required educated personnel with knowledge of classical texts and administrative principles, not just military strength and the ability to intimidate. The relative peace and stability of Liu Bang's early rule in Hanzhong was interrupted by growing tensions among the various kingdoms that had emerged from the anti-Qin rebellion like mushrooms after rain. Xiang Yu's feudal system proved inherently unstable from the beginning, as the various kings competed for territory and resources while increasingly questioning the hegemon king's authority over their internal affairs. Several of the kingdoms began forming alliances against Xiang Yu, seeing his military dominance as a threat to their independence and their ability to govern their own territories as they saw fit. Liu Bang's decision to emerge from Hanzhong and challenge Xiang Yu's hegemony was influenced by several converging factors that made 206 BC the right moment to act. Intelligence reports indicated that Xiang Yu's position was becoming increasingly precarious as more kingdoms joined coalitions against him, sensing weakness beneath the martial glory. Liu Bang's own military strength had grown significantly during his time in Hanzhong, as refugees from other regions sought the stability and moderate governance his administration provided, preferring his rule to the chaos elsewhere. Perhaps most importantly, Liu Bang and his brilliant advisors recognized that the feudal system Xiang Yu had established was fundamentally incompatible with the unified empire that China had become under the Qin, however brutal that unification had been. The fragmentation into competing kingdoms would inevitably lead to constant warfare and instability, preventing the peace and prosperity that populations desperately desired after years of conflict and oppression. The opening phase of what historians call the Chu-Han contention began in 206 BC when Liu Bang's forces emerged from Hanzhong and began moving eastward toward the central plains like water flowing downhill. This campaign demonstrated the military and administrative improvements Liu Bang had achieved during his period of apparent exile in the western mountains. His army was better organized, better supplied, and more disciplined than it had been during the anti-Qin rebellion, reflecting the administrative expertise of subordinates like Xiao He, who had used the peaceful period to develop more effective logistical systems that could maintain armies in the field for extended campaigns. Liu Bang's initial successes in the Chu-Han contention came not from dramatic battlefield victories that would inspire poets and historians, but from his ability to win over the populations of conquered territories through good governance. His policies of moderate taxation, reduced punishments, and respect for local customs contrasted sharply with the harsh exactions and arbitrary rule that characterized many of the other post-Qin kingdoms, where warlords extracted resources to maintain their armies. This approach allowed him to consolidate control over captured territories more effectively than rivals who relied primarily on military occupation and the threat of force. When Liu Bang's armies moved on to new campaigns, they left behind populations that actually supported Han rule, rather than waiting for opportunities to rebel. This created a snowball effect where each conquest strengthened his position for the next. The contrast between Liu Bang's and Xiang Yu's approaches to governance became particularly evident as the conflict intensified and their different philosophies were tested. Xiang Yu continued to rely on his personal military prowess and the loyalty of his aristocratic followers, but he showed little interest in or aptitude for the complex administrative tasks required to govern large territories effectively. His treatment of conquered populations was often harsh and sometimes deliberately cruel. He was known to massacre entire cities that had resisted him, and his tendency to relocate populations or destroy cities that had opposed him created lasting resentment that Liu Bang was able to exploit through his more moderate policies. The decisive victory at Gaixia marked the end of the Chu-Han contention, with finality that reverberated through Chinese history. But Liu Bang's transformation from rebel leader to legitimate emperor required far more than military triumph. It required building a new vision of governance. The suicide of Xiang Yu in 202 BC eliminated the most immediate threat to Liu Bang's authority. But the newly proclaimed Emperor Gaozu faced the absolutely monumental task of governing a war-torn empire that had experienced nearly 2 decades of continuous conflict, devastation, and administrative collapse. The administrative structures of the Qin dynasty lay in ruins, destroyed by rebellion and years of warfare. The economy was devastated by years of military campaigns that had destroyed agricultural production and disrupted trade networks. Regional powerholders throughout China maintained armies and territories that challenged central authority, and many were reluctant to submit to a former peasant who now claimed imperial dignity. Gaozu's approach to imperial governance reflected both pragmatic necessity and his deep understanding of the failures that had destroyed his predecessors. The harsh legalist system of the Qin had proven effective for conquest and initial unification through fear and standardization, but had generated the overwhelming popular resentment that ultimately destroyed the dynasty in just 15 years. Conversely, the feudal system that Xiang Yu had attempted to restore had proven utterly incapable of maintaining unity or preventing the constant warfare that had characterized the Chu Han period and exhausted the population. Gaozu's solution was to implement an ingenious hybrid system that combined centralized bureaucratic administration with carefully controlled feudal elements, trying to capture the advantages of both approaches while minimizing their weaknesses. The foundation of this hybrid system was the establishment of directly administered commanderies and counties in the most strategic regions of the empire, particularly in the former Qin heartland of Guangdong and the economically crucial areas of the Central Plains where most of China's population and agricultural production were concentrated. These territories were governed by appointed officials who served at the emperor's pleasure and could be transferred or dismissed without regard for local connections or hereditary claims. The administrative structure closely resembled the Qin system, with commandery governors, county magistrates, and various specialized officials handling taxation, military affairs, and judicial matters. However, the laws were significantly more moderate than Qin precedents, and officials were encouraged to govern with benevolence rather than mere efficiency. However, recognizing the political realities of his situation and the need to reward those who had supported him during the long struggle, Gaozu also granted semi-autonomous kingdoms to relatives and key allies whose support had been crucial during the Chu Han contention. These kingdoms were strategically concentrated in the frontier regions and areas that had been most resistant to central authority during the Qin period, where local power structures remained strong. The kings of these territories maintained their own administrative structures, collected taxes that went into their own treasuries, and commanded military forces that answered to them rather than to the central government. But they were expected to acknowledge imperial supremacy and provide military assistance when requested by the emperor. This arrangement was a delicate balancing act that would eventually prove unstable. The most significant of these kingdoms was granted to Han Xin, whose military genius had been instrumental in several crucial victories during the war against Xiang Yu, including the decisive final campaign. Han Xin received the kingdom of Chu, which encompassed much of the territory that had formed Xiang Yu's power base, a region with strong military traditions and independent spirit. This appointment served multiple purposes in Gaozu's complex political calculus. It rewarded Han Xin's loyalty and his undeniable military contributions to the victory. It provided a strong military presence in a region that might otherwise have remained hostile to Han rule, as the people there had supported Xiang Yu. And it demonstrated Gaozu's willingness to share power with capable subordinates rather than hoarding all authority for himself, encouraging others to serve loyally. Similarly, Peng Yue, whose guerrilla warfare tactics had disrupted Xiang Yu's supply lines and communications during the crucial final phase of the war, was granted the kingdom of Liang in the strategically important region between the imperial heartland and the eastern territories. Zhang Ao, who had been king of Zhao during the Chu Han period and had eventually sided with Liu Bang after carefully weighing his options, was confirmed in his position with reduced territory. This feudal component of Gaozu's governmental system was carefully designed to prevent the kind of independence that had characterized the kingdoms during Xiang Yu's brief hegemony and had made unified governance impossible. The kings were required to spend part of each year at the imperial capital, ensuring that they remained under the emperor's direct observation and influence, preventing them from becoming too isolated in their domains. Their kingdoms were also deliberately interspersed with directly administered territories, preventing any single king from controlling large contiguous regions that might serve as bases for rebellion or the development of truly independent power. Most importantly, for maintaining central control, the imperial government maintained authority over the appointment of key officials within the kingdoms, ensuring that the central administration had reliable sources of information about activities in these semi-autonomous territories and could monitor potential disloyalty. The implementation of this complex hybrid system required extraordinarily careful attention to personnel selection and administrative procedures. Gao Zu retained many of the bureaucratic innovations of the Qin period that had proven effective, including standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade, uniform currency that reduced transaction costs, and systematic record-keeping procedures that allowed the central government to monitor conditions throughout the empire. However, he significantly modified the harsh legal code that had made the Qin system so universally hated, reducing punishments for many offenses and eliminating some of the collective responsibility provisions that had terrorized local communities and made everyone live in constant fear. If you're enjoying this journey through Chinese history, remember to subscribe to the Flow of History channel for more content that brings the past to life. We explore the rise and fall of empires, the lives of remarkable individuals, and the patterns that shape human civilization across the ages. The emperor's approach to staffing his administration reflected his deep understanding of the diverse skills required for effective governance of a vast and complex empire. Military commanders who had proven their loyalty during the Chuhan contention were rewarded with high positions and generous grants, ensuring their continued support. But Gao Zu also actively recruited scholars and former officials who possessed the technical expertise necessary for complex administrative tasks like tax assessment, legal interpretation, and water management projects. Xiao He, who had served as Liu Bang's chief administrator since the early days of the rebellion when they were just a small band fighting for survival, was appointed as chancellor and given broad authority over civilian administration throughout the empire. His organizational genius and tireless work ethic were crucial to establishing the governmental infrastructure that would sustain the dynasty for centuries. The military structure of the early Han Dynasty required particular attention, as the emperor needed to maintain sufficient force to defend against external threats while preventing the dangerous concentration of military power that might challenge imperial authority. Gao Zu established a system of rotating commands and divided military responsibilities among multiple generals, ensuring that no single individual could accumulate enough force to pose a serious threat to the throne through military coup. The imperial guards were placed under the direct command of trusted relatives and longtime associates whose loyalty had been tested through years of shared struggle, creating a reliable military force that could respond quickly to any challenges to imperial authority. While establishing these governmental structures, Gao Zu faced immediate military challenges that tested both his administrative systems and his strategic judgment in ways that would shape Han foreign policy for generations. The most serious of these threats came from the Xiongnu Confederation in the north, a powerful nomadic empire that had been expanding its territory and influence during the chaotic final years of the Qin Dynasty and the subsequent Chuhan contention, when Chinese attention was focused inward. The Xiongnu had taken advantage of Chinese internal conflicts to occupy territory that had previously been under imperial control, and their highly mobile cavalry forces posed a fundamentally different military challenge than the infantry-based armies that had characterized the recent civil wars. The Xiongnu Confederation was led by Modu Chanyu, a ruler whose military and political skills had enabled him to unite the various nomadic tribes of the northern steppes into a formidable fighting force that could field hundreds of thousands of mounted warriors. Madu's army consisted primarily of mounted archers whose mobility and firepower gave them significant advantages over traditional Chinese infantry formations that had been designed for different types of warfare. Gaozu's initial approach to the Xiongnu threat reflected his confidence in the military machine that had defeated Xiongnu and his dangerous underestimation of the unique challenges posed by nomadic warfare in the vast steppes. In 200 BC, he personally led a large army northward to confront Madu's forces, expecting that the superior numbers and organization of his troops would achieve a decisive victory similar to those that had characterized the final phase of the Chu-Han contention. The campaign began promisingly enough, with Han forces achieving several minor victories against Xiongnu raiding parties and advancing deep into territory that the nomads had recently occupied. However, these initial successes proved to be part of a carefully planned Xiongnu strategy designed to draw the Chinese army away from its supply bases and into terrain that favored nomadic tactics, open steppes where cavalry could maneuver freely. The crisis came when Gaozu and a substantial portion of his army were surrounded by Xiongnu forces at Baideng, near the frontier city of Pingcheng. The emperor's situation was desperate. His troops were cut off from supplies and faced constant harassment from mounted archers who could attack and withdraw before the Chinese infantry could respond effectively. The siege lasted for 7 agonizing days, during which Gaozu's forces suffered significant casualties and came perilously close to complete disaster that would have destroyed the Han Dynasty before it truly began. The emperor's escape from Baideng was achieved through a combination of diplomatic cunning and military deception that demonstrated his ability to adapt to unexpected challenges and find creative solutions. According to historical accounts that may contain some embellishment, Gaozu's advisors managed to establish secret communications with Madu's wife, convincing her that a decisive Xiongnu victory might lead to Chinese women being brought to the steppe as concubines for Xiongnu warriors, potentially diminishing her own position and influence. Whether or not this diplomatic maneuver was the decisive factor in the outcome, Madu agreed to allow the Chinese forces to withdraw in exchange for substantial tribute payments and recognition of Xiongnu control over disputed border territories. This was a humiliating outcome for the emperor who had just unified China, but it was far better than the alternative of complete military annihilation. The Baideng incident fundamentally altered Gaozu's approach to northern frontier defense and demonstrated the severe limitations of conventional military solutions to the nomadic threat. Rather than continuing to pursue expensive and ineffective military campaigns that drained resources and produced no lasting results, the emperor implemented a comprehensive defensive strategy that combined diplomatic engagement with systematic fortification of the northern borders, a strategy that prioritized stability over martial glory. This approach, known as the Qin system, involved regular tribute payments to the Xiongnu in exchange for peace along the frontier, supplemented by marriage alliances between Chinese princesses and Xiongnu leaders to create kinship bonds between the two powers. The Qin system was deeply controversial among Chinese officials who viewed tribute payments as humiliating acknowledgments of barbarian superiority and a stain on imperial dignity. But Gaozu recognized with characteristic pragmatism that the economic cost of regular tribute, consisting of silk, grain, wine, and other luxury goods that were valuable to the nomadic economy, was far less than the enormous expense of maintaining large armies in constant readiness for frontier warfare. More importantly, the system provided crucial stability along the northern frontier that allowed the Han government to focus on internal consolidation and economic recovery from decades of warfare. The defensive infrastructure that supported the Qin system involved both the restoration of existing fortifications built during the Qin period and the construction of new defensive works along the northern border. Many of the walls and fortified positions that had been built during the Qin period had fallen into serious disrepair during the years of civil war, and Gaozu ordered extensive reconstruction efforts that employed thousands of workers and consumed substantial resources but were essential for frontier security. While addressing external military threats, Gaozu simultaneously implemented economic policies designed to restore prosperity to regions devastated by years of warfare and bring relief to populations that had suffered immensely. The emperor's approach to economic recovery reflected his understanding that political stability ultimately depended on the welfare of the agricultural population that formed the foundation of Chinese society and produced the resources that sustained everything else. The most immediate priority was agricultural recovery, as many farming regions had been abandoned or severely damaged during the Chu-Han contention, when armies marched back and forth across the landscape, requisitioning supplies and destroying what they couldn't use. Gaozu implemented dramatic tax reduction policies that allowed farmers to retain a much larger portion of their harvests, providing strong incentives for the restoration of abandoned fields and the expansion of cultivation into new areas that had previously been marginal. The standard tax rate was set at 1/15 of the harvest, significantly lower than the crushing rates that had prevailed during the Qin period when the government took as much as 2/3 of production. Additional reductions were granted to regions that had suffered particularly severe war damage, giving them time to recover. Labor obligations were also substantially reduced from the crushing levels that had characterized the final years of the Qin Dynasty, when men were taken from their fields for months or even years at a time. The death of Emperor Gaozu in 195 BC marked the beginning of one of the most precarious periods in early Han history, as the empire faced its first major succession crisis. The emperor's passing came after a prolonged illness that had weakened his ability to manage the complex political dynamics he had carefully balanced throughout his reign. His chosen successor, Crown Prince Liu Ying, was barely 16 years old and possessed neither the political experience nor the personal authority necessary to maintain control over the powerful factions that had emerged within the imperial court and the regional kingdoms. Empress Luji, who had been Gaozu's wife since before his rise to power when he was just a minor official in Pei County, immediately positioned herself as the dominant force in the new administration. Unlike the palace women of later dynasties, who were often selected primarily for their beauty or family connections, Empress Lu had been Liu Bang's partner during his early struggles against both the Qin and Shang Yu, and she possessed intimate knowledge of the political networks and military relationships that sustained Han rule. Her understanding of court politics was matched by a ruthless determination to protect her son's throne and eliminate any potential threats to Liu family supremacy. The Empress Dowager's initial actions as regent demonstrated both her considerable political acumen and her chilling willingness to use extreme measures to secure power. She began by systematically consolidating control over the imperial guards and the key administrative positions within the capital, replacing officials whose loyalty was questionable with individuals who owed their advancement directly to her patronage and would follow her orders without question. Empress Lu's most immediate concern was the network of Liu family kings, who controlled substantial territories and military forces throughout the empire and might challenge her authority or her son's legitimacy. While the White Horse Covenant had established the principle that only Liu family members could rule as emperors, it had also created a system in which numerous imperial relatives possessed semi-autonomous power bases that could potentially be used against the central government. The systematic elimination of potential rivals began with Liu Ruyi, the king of Zhao, who was Gaozu's son by a concubine named Lady Qi. During the emperor's final years, Lady Qi had attempted to persuade him to name Liu Ruyi as crown prince instead of Liu Ying, arguing that the younger prince possessed greater intelligence and stronger character. Although Gaozu had ultimately retained Liu Ying as his heir, the Empress Dowager viewed both Lady Qi and her son as ongoing existential threats to the succession. Liu Ruyi was summoned to the capital under the pretext of paying respects to his deceased father and participating in court ceremonies. Despite warnings from his advisors about the dangers of leaving his kingdom, where he was protected by loyal officials and troops, the young king felt compelled to demonstrate his loyalty to the new emperor and traveled to Chang'an with only a small retinue. Once in the capital, he was effectively held under house arrest, prevented from returning to his kingdom while the Empress Dowager maneuvered to eliminate him permanently through methods that would not appear too obviously as murder. The eventual murder of Liu Ruyi was accomplished through poison administered during a court banquet, though the Empress Dowager ensured that the death appeared to result from sudden illness rather than deliberate assassination. Lady Qi suffered an even more brutal fate, being subjected to torture and mutilation before her execution in a display of cruelty that shocked even the hardened court officials who had witnessed the violence of the recent civil wars. She was mutilated, deprived of sight and hearing, and displayed as a warning to anyone who might challenge Empress Lu's authority. These actions served not only to eliminate specific threats, but also to demonstrate the Empress Dowager's absolute willingness to use extreme measures against anyone who challenged her authority, no matter their relationship to the imperial family. The message was received clearly throughout the empire. Opposition to Empress Lu's rule would be met with swift and merciless retaliation. The elimination of Liu Ruyi created a vacancy in the strategically important Kingdom of Zhao, which controlled territory along the northern frontier, where Xiongnu raids remained a constant concern, requiring strong military leadership. Rather than appointing another Liu family member to this crucial position, Empress Lu made the unprecedented and shocking decision to install her own nephew, Lu, as the new king. This appointment directly violated the sacred White Horse Covenant that Gaozu had established as the foundation of dynastic legitimacy and represented a dangerous precedent for non-Liu family members to hold royal titles within the empire. The death of Empress Lu in 180 BC created an immediate succession crisis that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the system she had established through force and intimidation. Unlike the Lu family, which possessed multiple potential heirs and a clear succession principle established by the White Horse Covenant, the Lu clan lacked both the numbers and the institutional framework necessary to maintain control over the complex imperial government. The Empress Dowager had concentrated so much authority in her own person that her death left a catastrophic power vacuum that her relatives were utterly unable to fill effectively. The conspiracy that ultimately overthrew the Lu clan began to form among court officials and military commanders who had served under Gaozu and retained loyalty to the Liu family despite years of Lu clan dominance. These individuals recognized that the Empress Dowager's death provided a unique opportunity to restore Liu family rule, but they also understood that successful action would require careful coordination and precise timing to prevent Liu family forces from mounting effective resistance that could plunge the empire back into civil war. The key figures in this conspiracy included Chen Ping, who had served as one of Gaozu's most trusted advisors throughout the rebellion and early Han period, and had maintained his position in the imperial government throughout the Liu clan interregnum by carefully avoiding direct confrontation while building networks of loyal officials. Zhou Bo, who commanded the Northern Army and possessed the military strength necessary to overcome Liu clan forces in direct combat, provided the essential armed component of the conspiracy. Together, they coordinated with Liu family kings to restore legitimate rule and save the dynasty Liu Bang had built from usurpation and destruction. The Han Dynasty would survive this crisis and flourish for centuries more, but that story continues in ways we'll explore in future